Hello there friends, it's Emma here, the Bookish Princess. I'm sharing my chair today with a stack of books. There's nothing unusual about that. But today they are all Jane Austen books. As promised, we are going to be going through Jane Austen's works and also her letters and looking at other literary works that she references. If you're planning on participating in Febregency next month, then this list should hopefully help you out, give you some inspiration. I have divided it up, so we're going to look at books that are referenced in the novels and then also some books that she references in her letters. It's fun in the letters, especially because you can hear about what she thought about the books that she read, and it feels like, you know, watching a booktuber. Sometimes she says, oh, I didn't expect to like this, but I did, or oh, this was awful. So I have my list. I am going to try to type this out, and actually, I think I will put it on my brand new blog. It's a new year, a good time to start some new projects, and I've been wanting to do more with writing and thinking it would be fun to get back into blogging. So I did create a little blog. I think I'll probably start by posting my YouTube videos there, but then when I post the video, I'll maybe also give like a little extra behind the scenes or like a little extra write-up, and then we'll just see what other ideas I have and where it ends up going. I'm sure my blog will cover the same sort of assortment of lovely things and fun topics that my YouTube channel does, just in written form instead of in video form. There is actually an option to enter your email if you want to get the posts sent to your email inbox, or you can just check out the website and check in for updates. So anyway, I will post a kind of written list of what I'm mentioning here. This is not an exhaustive or complete list. These are just some of the works that have stood out to me and that I've always meant to jot down and kind of make a reading list for myself. Actually, it should be fun to have this to reference in the future. There are some of these books that I put on my Febregency TBR, which I shared in last week's video along with a little book haul, but there is no way you would be able to get to all these works in a month. I'm sure I will be chipping away at this list for years to come. But I love Jane Austen so much, it's always fun to read the books that she references to kind of get a little bit better context and get to know her a little bit more. It's always fun to piece together different sides of a person's personality through what they read and what books they enjoy. Without further ado, let's get into it. So I'm not planning on giving away any spoilers, but I am going to be citing different parts of the books. I guess if I come to anything super spoilery, I will let you know. I thought we would start out with Northanger Abbey, which chronologically is one of the first books that Jane Austen wrote, although it wasn't published during her lifetime. It was published after she had passed away. So this was set kind of in the early Regency period, and it's a spoof on the Gothic novel, which was popular at that time. Anne Radcliffe is one of the very frequently referenced authors. When I was doing some research for this video, I thought it was interesting. There's a book called The Female Quixote, which is a great title. It's by Charlotte Lennox. And the premise is kind of similar to Northanger Abbey, except it takes the spoof, I think, much more seriously. And like, it's a young girl who really takes kind of the lessons she learns in Gothic novels seriously, which Catherine Morland does a little bit, but like not to the full extent that I think happens in The Female Quixote. That is referenced in one of Jane Austen's letters, but it's not actually referenced in Northanger Abbey. This book, though, has lots of literary references, and in fact, it starts out with kind of a description of what Catherine Morland has been reading in her training to become a heroine. In the first few pages, we hear some extracts from Pope, from Gray, from Thomson, and from Shakespeare, so all the poets that are necessary reading. One of the challenges for Febregency is focused on poetry, so you could pick up any of those poets. But there are some great passages in Northanger Abbey about the novel, which I really love. This is when Catherine and Isabella first become friends. They called each other by their Christian name, were always arm in arm when they walked, pinned up each other's train for the dance, and were not to be divided in the set. And if a rainy morning deprived them of other enjoyments, they were still resolute in meeting in defiance of wet and dirt, and shut themselves up to read novels together. Yes, novels, for I will not adopt that ungenerous and impolitic custom so common with novel writers of degrading by their contemptuous censor the very performances, to the number of which they are themselves adding. Alas, if the heroine of one novel be not patronized by the heroine of another, from whom can she expect protection and regard? Although our productions have afforded more extensive and unaffected pleasure than those of any other literary corporation in the world, no species of composition has been so much decried. From pride, ignorance, or fashion, our foes are almost as many as our readers. And while the abilities of the 900th abridger of the history of England, or the man who collects and publishes in a volume some dozen lines of Milton, Pope, and Prior, with a paper from the Spectator and a chapter from Sterne, are eulogized by 1,000 pens, there seems almost a general wish of decrying the capacity and undervaluing the labor of the novelist, and of slighting the performances which have only genius, wit, and taste to recommend them. And what are you reading, miss? Oh, it is only a novel, replies the young lady, while she lays down her book with affected indifference or momentary shame. It is only Cecilia, or Camilla, or Belinda, or in short, only some work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. Obviously, we no longer feel today what people in Jane Austen's age sometimes felt about the novel. But I love that passage, and it gives you a pretty good reading list to start from, whether you'd prefer to go with the more serious nonfiction like The Spectator, or if you would go for a novel such as Cecilia, Camilla, or Belinda. Cecilia and Camilla are by Fanny Burney. Belinda is by Maria Edgeworth. Surprisingly, this passage does not introduce us to Anne Radcliffe, whose praises are very much sung throughout the rest of the work. The Mysteries of Udolpho is what Catherine Morland is reading. Isabella has a reading list of Gothic novels and horror novels for them to start on after that. When you have finished Udolpho, we will read the Italian together, and I have made out a list of 10 or 12 more of the same kind for you. Have you indeed? How glad I am. What are they all? I will read you their names directly. Here they are in my pocketbook. Castle of Wolfenbach, Claremont, Mysterious Warnings, Necromancer of the Black Forest, Midnight Bell, Orphan of the Rhine, and Horrid Mysteries. Those will last us some time. Those would last you some time. Not all of them are by Anne Radcliffe, but there you go. If you're looking for Gothic literature, Isabella's list should get you started. We hear that Isabella's brother John Thorpe has been reading The Monk by Matthew Gregory Lewis and also Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. I'm not sure how much I trust John Thorpe's taste, but there you have it. The hero of the novel, Mr. Tilney, has also read Udolpho and Anne Radcliffe, and I love when they discuss it on their walk above Bath. The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid. I have read all Mrs. Radcliffe's works, and most of them with great pleasure. The Mysteries of Udolpho, when I had once begun it, I could not lay down again. I remember finishing it in 2 days, my hair standing on end the whole time. I have to admit that I've been in the middle of The Mysteries of Udolpho for several months now, and there is some excitement in Udolpho. It just hasn't pulled me in that much. But listen to this. Yes, added Miss Tilney, and I remember that you undertook to read it aloud to me, and that when I was called away for only 5 minutes to answer a note, instead of waiting for me, you took the volume into the Hermitage Walk, and I was obliged to stay till you had finished it. I really do need to finish The Mysteries of Udolpho. I was enjoying it. It's just the kind of long descriptive passages had me bogged down a bit. In that same walk above Bath, Henry Tilney gives Catherine a lecture on the picturesque, the idea of what makes a good painting, and in the biographical notice that Jane Austen's brothers wrote, he mentions that Austen, especially when she was young, so probably around the time she was writing this, was a big fan of William Gilpin and his essays on the picturesque, so he kind of defined what it meant for a scene to be picturesque, what it meant to have a beautiful layout for a painting and a pleasing composition. And Gilpin is also mentioned somewhat obliquely in Sense and Sensibility. Edmund comes to visit the Dashwoods, and he goes for a walk, and he's admiring the scenery, and Marianne, who is very much a fan of the picturesque, is glad to hear his enthusiasm, but he warns her, you know, look, I'm not really an expert in this. I just think it looked nice. It exactly answers my idea of a fine country because it unites beauty with utility, and I dare say it is a picturesque one too because you admire it. I can easily believe it to be full of rocks and promontories, gray moss and brushwood, but those are all lost on me. I know nothing of the picturesque. Marianne goes on to admit that there are some people who make too much of the picturesque. Admiration of landscape scenery has become a mere jargon, everybody pretends to feel and tries to describe with the taste and elegance of him who first defined what picturesque beauty was. So I think him who first defined what picturesque beauty was refers to William Gilpin and his essays. During that same visit with Edmund and the Dashwoods, Mrs. Dashwood actually makes a reference. It's just in the course of a conversation she says to Edmund, "Since leisure has not promoted your own happiness, your sons will be brought up to as many pursuits, employments, professions, and trades as Columella's." And Columella is apparently a book by Richard Graves. From what I was reading about it online, it sounds like it's very appropriate for Sense and Sensibility because the character has lots of sensibilities that kind of lead him to all sorts of different trades and pursuits. There's a fair bit of bookish talk while Edmund is staying with the Dashwoods. They're imagining what they would do if they suddenly inherited a fortune. As for Marianne, I know her greatness of soul. There would not be music enough in London to content her. And books, Thomson, Cooper, Scott, she would buy them all over and over again. She would buy every copy, I believe, to prevent their falling into unworthy hands. And she would have every book that tells her how to admire an old twisted tree. So Thomson, Cooper, and Scott are poets. Thomson was one of the ones referenced that Catherine Morland would have read. And Cooper, we hear from Jane Austen's brother, was one of her favorite poets. He is sprinkled in all throughout the books. We actually saw him earlier in Sense and Sensibility. Marianne actually was not pleased with how Edmund was reading a poem of Cooper's. To hear those beautiful lines, which have frequently almost driven me wild, pronounced with such impenetrable calmness, such dreadful indifference. He would certainly have done more justice to simple and elegant prose. I thought so at the time, but you would give him Cooper. Nay, mamma, if he is not to be animated by Cooper. I wonder which poem it is exactly that Jane had in mind for Edmund to be reading. In one of the Jane Austen film adaptations, they go with The Castaway by Cooper. "No voice divine the storm allayed, no light propitious shone. When snatched from all effectual aid, we perished each alone." That is the Emma Thompson adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, and I think they do a good job of filling in the poetry. They make kind of a little theme of one of Shakespeare's sonnets. I think it's 116. "Let me not to the marriage of two true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove." That's a poem that puts Marianne in mind of Willoughby, and of course Marianne and Willoughby do share a love of poetry. This is when they first meet. "For one morning I think you have done pretty well. You have already ascertained Mr. Willoughby's opinion in almost every matter of importance. You know what he thinks of Cooper and Scott, you are certain of his estimating their beauties as he ought, and you have received every assurance of his admiring Pope no more than is proper." So a little shade thrown at Pope there, but Cooper and Scott almost always get the seal of approval. Now I of course have Pride and Prejudice in my stack of books here, but interestingly, there aren't a whole lot of literary references in Pride and Prejudice, and there weren't any that really stood out to me that I thought I would put on this list. I feel like the one that always comes to mind first is Fordyce's Sermons, which is associated with Mr. Collins and Mary Bennet, and sounds like a bit of a snooze fest, although, maybe it has been maligned. Maybe I should actually read Fordyce's Sermons someday and see. There's probably some good stuff in there, in spite of the fact that Mr. Collins reads it. In one of her letters, Jane Austen says that maybe Pride and Prejudice is a bit too light, bright, and sparkling, and she should have, mixed in like a passage on history or like something that was more serious. I don't think Pride and Prejudice is missing anything, but it is kind of interesting that on this list, I didn't really have any literary allusions to add to it from Pride and Prejudice. Emma, on the other hand, does have some literary allusions. It's funny, we don't necessarily hear the reading lists of the main characters. Like, at one point, Mr. Knightley mentions that Emma put together a reading list when she was just a teenager, and he kept it for a while because it was so impressive, but we don't actually get to hear what's on the reading list. We do, however, hear about what Harriet Smith and Robert Martin have been reading. Sometimes of an evening, before we went to cards, he would read something aloud out of the Elegant Extracts, very entertaining. And I know he has read the Vicar of Wakefield. He never read The Romance of the Forest, nor The Children of the Abbey. He had never heard of such books before I mentioned them, but he is determined to get them now as soon as ever he can. The Romance of the Forest is our friend Anne Radcliffe again. Vicar of Wakefield is by William Goldsmith. I read that once. It was about two sisters. I remember enjoying it at the time. Elegant Extracts sounds like it was an anthology of all sorts of different poetry. And of course, we hear later in the book that Emma herself and Harriet both were putting together their own sort of, sounds like a Pinterest board, really, a little scrapbook of poetry. Again, we don't get too minute a list of what poems are in Harriet's poetry collection, although Mr. Woodhouse contributes a poem by Garrick about Kitty, a fair but frozen maid. The other literary allusion on my list comes towards the end of the book. This, I guess, is a spoiler, kind of. Emma's former governess, Mrs. Weston, marries Mr. Weston at the beginning of the novel, and at the end of the novel, she has a little girl, and Emma says that Mrs. Weston has had the advantage, you know, of practicing on me, like la bâton d'Allemagne on La Comtesse d'Ostalis in Madame de Genlis's Adelaide and Theodore, and we shall now see her own little Adelaide educated on a more perfect plan. I've never read Adelaide and Theodore. I think I read online that she must have read it in translation. It was by Madame de Genlis. Marianne, in Sense and Sensibility, had a passion for poetry, but Anne Elliot, in Persuasion, is also a poetry lover, and we get some interesting conversations between her and Captain Benwick. Having talked of poetry, the richness of the present age, and gone through a brief comparison of opinion as to the first-rate poets, trying to ascertain whether Marmion or the Lady of the Lake were to be preferred, and how ranked the Giaour and the Bride of Abydos, and moreover, how the Giaour was to be pronounced. I don't know how it's to be pronounced. So these works are Sir Walter Scott is Marmion and Lady of the Lake, and Lord Byron is Giaour and the Bride of Abydos. Another poem we hear referenced is by Prior, and this is another case where it's not a character reading it, it's a character kind of comparing their situation to something in the story. Is this a spoiler? I guess it could be considered a spoiler. She endeavored to be composed and to be just. Without emulating the feelings of an Emma towards her Henry, she would have attended on Louisa with a zeal above the common claims of regard for his sake. She hoped he would not long be so unjust as to suppose she would shrink unnecessarily from the office of a friend. So Henry and Emma is the poem by Prior. We get the feeling that Anne Elliot was a very good reader, because this is not the only time she kind of sort of mentally compares her situation to that of a character in literature. Later on, she is at a musical assembly and she's trying to kind of machinate quietly to get herself at the end of a row so she'll be closer to talk to somebody. She could not do so without comparing herself with Miss Larolles, the inimitable Miss Larolles, but still she did it. Miss Larolles, I think, is kind of a over-the-top character in Cecilia by Fanny Burney, which I have read. I don't remember Miss Larolles very much, but it sounds like she must have been a finagler. I almost forgot, I mentioned this in my TBR, but one sort of literary reference from Pride and Prejudice is that there is a speech at the end of Cecilia where there's kind of a memorable moment where Pride and Prejudice, that phrase is used. So it seems like Cecilia was the inspiration for the Pride and Prejudice title. I have two other literary references marked in here. One of these I love because it's one of my favorite poems and my favorite places. And it's a really kind of subtle little nod. Jane Austen is describing Lyme Regis, which is such a beautiful little seaside resort in England that the characters visit. The woody varieties of the cheerful village of Uplyme, and above all Pinny, with its green chasms between romantic rocks, where the scattered forest trees and orchards of luxuriant growth declare that many a generation must have passed away since the first partial fallings of the cliff prepared the ground for such a state. And of course, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, whereof the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. But ah, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedarn cover. The green chasms and the romantic rocks seem like they are a nod to Coleridge and Kubla Khan. And then we have a very brief nod to Arabian Nights. When you start looking at the references in the letters and the novels, it's fun to see the wide variety of books and subjects that Jane Austen read. This is Anne, once again, finding a literary comparison. This is somewhat of a spoiler, could be. She had promised to be with the Musgroves from breakfast to dinner. Her faith was plighted, and Mr. Elliot's character, like the Sultan of Scheherazad's head, must live another day. Scheherazade was the famous storyteller in Arabian Nights who would tell an amazing story every night, and so the king would put off killing her, which he usually did with his wives. Who would expect that? There's Scheherazade in Persuasion. Fanny Price in Mansfield Park is also a great reader. In fact, when she goes to visit Portsmouth, she gets a library card and takes great delight in introducing her sister to, I think she says, works of biography and poetry. In fact, a lot of the works that I referenced are not necessarily novels like Northanger Abbey, but somewhat more serious works. I love when we see Fanny in the East Room, which is kind of her private retreat, and Edmund mentions what she's reading. You, in the meanwhile, will be taking a trip into China, I suppose. How does Lord Macartney go on? Opening a volume on the table and then taking up some others. And here are Crabbe's Tales and The Idler at hand to relieve you if you tire of your great book. So The Idler was a volume of essays by Samuel Johnson, who was supposedly Jane Austen's favorite prose writer, and Crabbe's Tales is a collection of poetry by the poet Crabbe. We'll see if I have time to get to those two during Febregency. I don't think I'll have time to get to this one, but Lord Macartney refers to his work called Journal of Embassy to China, which makes total sense because Fanny has a brother, William, in the Navy, and he's traveling all around the world, and he brings her back some mementos from the various places he goes. But it makes total sense that she would want to read about these places he's visiting. In fact, there is a reference in Jane Austen's letters that she's reading a work by Sir John Carr that was descriptive travels of, I think, Spain. It was another travelogue, and she references it. Some piece of information in it she was going to use in Mansfield Park. Acting arrives at Mansfield Park, and the young people decide to hold a private theater. And it's very interesting to hear what plays of the day they thought of performing. Apparently Jane Austen and her siblings would perform at Steventon, their family home. On the tragic side were the Miss Bertrams, Henry Crawford, and Mr. Yates. On the comic, Tom Bertram, not quite alone because it was evident that Mary Crawford's wishes, though politely kept back, inclined the same way. All the best plays were run over in vain. Neither Hamlet, nor Macbeth, nor Othello, nor Douglas, nor The Gamester presented anything that could satisfy even the tragedians. And the rivals, The School for Scandal, Wheel of Fortune, Heir at Law, and Along, etc., were successfully dismissed with yet warmer objections. One of our challenges for Febregency is to read a play. That list could be a good place to start. Of course, the play they end up going with is called Lover's Vows by Elizabeth Inchbald. It's not quite proper, it seems like, for these gentlemen and ladies to be acting in. I've never read Lover's Vows. At some point, I'd like to get to it. Last year, I did read another play that the characters in this read, and that is a Shakespeare play, Henry VIII. Fanny and Aunt Bertram were reading the play when Edmund and Mr. Crawford come in from the drawing room, and so Mr. Crawford picks it up to continue reading. The king, the queen, Buckingham, Wolsey, Cromwell, all were given in turn. For with the happiest knack, the happiest power of jumping and guessing, he could always light at will on the best scene or the best speeches of each. And whether it were dignity or pride or tenderness or remorse or whatever were to be expressed, he could do it with equal beauty. It was truly dramatic. So Mr. Crawford is an excellent actor and an excellent reader, but it was fun when I read Henry VIII this past year. Really enjoyed trying to imagine which passages Henry Crawford would have read. And then the last item on my list for Mansfield Park is really just a contemporary of Jane Austen's, but he did leave some writings on his area of expertise behind, and it was Repton. So Mr. Rushworth, one of the characters, is talking about redoing his gardens, and he's talking about how a friend had Repton, this garden architect, in. So there's another idea for Febregency that could be for the nonfiction challenge. Go and check out what Repton actually had to say about landscape gardening. What would he have done to, what would he have suggested at Southerton? What renovations? Mr. Rushworth thinks that he would want to have an avenue of trees come down. Again, pops up the poet Cooper. Fanny says, "Cut down an avenue, what a pity. Does not it make you think of Cooper? Ye fallen avenues, once more I mourn your fate unmerited." I feel like Cooper doesn't get as much love these days as, you know, the romantic poets Wordsworth and Coleridge. But realizing how often he comes up in Jane Austen is making me determined to get to some Cooper for Febregency. Okay, so quickly I will let you know a couple of the things that I had underlined in Jane Austen's letters. I feel like this video has already gone on too long. And Jane Austen's letters, like I said, are just chock full of what she's reading, what people have recommended to her, whether she likes it, whether she doesn't like it. When she's in London, she writes about the plays that they go to see. At one point, she writes about how they started a sort of literary society and that another town is making their own kind of book club, but they've totally stole the idea from them, and their literary society won't be nearly as good. Here's one passage from a letter she wrote to Cassandra on January 24th, 1813. We quite run over with books. She has got Sir John Carr's Travels in Spain. That's the one she referenced using for a detail in Mansfield Park. From Miss B, and I am reading A Society Octavo, an essay on the military police and institutions of the British Empire by Captain Paulsley of the Engineers, a book which I protested against at first, but which upon trial I find delightfully written and highly entertaining. I am as much in love with the author as I ever was with Clarkson or Buchanan, or even the two Mr. Smiths of the city, the first soldier I ever sighed for, but he does write with extraordinary force and spirit. Yesterday, moreover, brought us Mrs. Grant's letters, that I think was also a travelogue, with Mr. White's comps, C-O-M-P-T-S, but I've disposed of them, comps and all, for the first fortnight to Miss Papillon, and among so many readers or retainers of books as we have in Chawton, I dare say there will be no difficulty in getting rid of them for another fortnight if necessary. I guess she wasn't too eager to read those other two. Here's where she references the play that I'm planning to read, for Febregency. We did go to the play after all on Saturday. We went to the Lyceum and saw The Hypocrite, an old play taken from Moliere's Tartuffe, and were well entertained. Doughton and Matthews were the good actors. Mrs. Edwin was the heroine, and her performance is just what it used to be. I have no chance of seeing Mrs. Siddons. She did act on Monday, but as Henry was told by the box-keeper that he did not think she would, the places and all thought of it were given up. I should particularly have liked to see her in Constance, and could swear at her with little effort for disappointing me. When you hear Jane Austen talking to her sister, like, there's just so much humor and fun. It's such a delight to be able to kind of sit in on their conversations. Here's a reference in an early letter from November 25th, 1798. We have got Fitz Albany. My father has bought it against my private wishes, for it does not quite satisfy my feelings that we should purchase the only one of Egerton's works, of which his family are ashamed. That these scruples, however, do not at all interfere with my reading it, you will easily believe. We have neither of us yet finished the first volume. My father is disappointed. I am not, for I expected nothing better. Never did any book carry more internal evidence of its author. Every sentiment is completely Egerton's. There is very little story, and what there is, told in a strange, unconnected way. There are many characters introduced, apparently merely to be delineated. That does not really make me want to add Fitz Albany by Egerton to my list. But I just love the way she describes what she's reading. It's almost more interesting when she doesn't like it. In fact, it was probably more entertaining to go on a little rant when you didn't like something than to write about something you did. We've got Ida of Athens by Miss Owenson, which must be very clever because it was written by, as the authoress says, in 3 months. We have only read the preface yet, but her Irish girl does not make me expect much. If the warmth of her language could affect the body, it might be worth reading in this weather. That one was written January 1809. So it must have been chilly out. All right, well, this video has gone on long enough, but hopefully that gave you guys some ideas. Those were some of the works that were on Jane Austen's reading list. There are, of course, lots of other excellent lists out there on the internet of, you know, allusions to literary works in Jane Austen. One of the ones that I found really helpful was on Pemberley.org. And it actually, I think, came from written by Chapman, who was the first person who collected and edited her letters. But it was really helpful because it actually cited, you know, here's this author, they were referenced in this letter or in this chapter of this novel. And it was really neat to be able to see, okay, this author, she referenced multiple works in multiple different places. I'll definitely make sure I leave that webpage linked down below, so if you're looking for more, you can check it out. If you have any favorite works that you've read that you first heard about from Jane Austen, or anything you're planning to read for Febregency, leave me a comment and tell me about it down below. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed. I'll talk to you guys again soon, and until then, I hope you have a magical day.